Hello. In this lecture again, we shall offer an easy, informative entry into African literature for master students. I believe our students are not familiar with African literature. It is their first time to read and to discuss this genre. Let us start with a definition. What is African literature? In fact, it is estimated that there are 2,000 African languages spoken in Africa as a whole. However, there is no language called African. Africa is not a country either. Therefore, we are talking here about literatures, I said with an S, with a multicultural and linguistic variety, literatures that are spread and scattered all over the continent since the Berlin Conference, when the capitalist powers of Europe sat and carved an entire continent with a multiplicity of peoples, cultures, and languages into different colonies. In a word, African literature is an umbrella term that covers a huge, rich variety of literatures, both written and oral, in many languages such as Swahili, Arabic, Gikuyu, Igbo, and others. A common characteristic in African literature is the use of proverbs, which Achebe defines as the palm oil with which words are eaten. Therefore, one would easily know an African literature because of the high volume of proverbs in it. So this is the first characteristic. The second characteristic by Ngugi wa Thiong'o is the use of oral literary traditions and storytelling. He said that during childhood he could vividly recall those evenings of storytelling around the fireside. So this is the second characteristic. However, what about literature written by non-Africans about Africa? Can we call it African literature? Is Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, for instance, an African work? No, it is not. Is Rudyard Kipling The Jungle Book about India an Indian work? No, it is not. So African literature must be written by an African about Africans. This takes us to the next question. What about African literatures written in French and English? These are not African languages. Even Arabic is not an African language. Let us answer these questions in the following stage, which is the politics of language in African literature. Achebe said, defending the use of English as a language of expression, I see a new voice coming out of Africa, speaking of African experience in a worldwide language. The task of the African writer, in consequence, was to aim at fashioning out an English which is at once universal and able to carry his peculiar experience. So, Achebe, in his novels, tried to Africanize English language, to make it his own. He tried to make the language of the colonizer his own. He is using the colonizer's language as a passport to reach worldwide audience. So how does he Africanize English language? He used exophoric references These exophoric references need a glossary to be understood in the novel, so he used them without translation. Exophoric references are words and expressions that are related to our culture, to our Arab or to our Arabic or African culture. So, Achebe used them without translation to captivate the attention of the reader and to hook his attention. These exophoric references thus will turn into cultural references. For instance, Asya Jabbar, Muhammad Deeb, Yasmina Khadra, in their works they use such exophoric references. We may find words like masjid, hara, ra'is, hammam without translation. So these words are related to our culture. They are not translated. Consequently, one of the world's great novels, which is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which have been translated into more than 30 languages, is unable to appear in the language, the African language of the very people that it celebrates. This is very strange. So Achebe's intention in writing Things Fall Apart was to demonstrate to European readers and writers their own incomplete and distorted view of African culture. So he needed to write in English. English also enabled him to address a Nigerian audience. He needed to use a lingua franca, not a tribal language such as Igbo. So, what is lingua franca? And who are the Igbo? The Igbo is the tribe of Chinua Achebe. You have to know that in Nigeria there are four major tribes. We have the Igbo, the Hausa, the Fulani, and the Yoruba. So each one of them has its own language, and the official language in Constitution is English. So Achebe used English as a lingua franca, as a shared language for his novel. Therefore, we may say that the main topic in Achebe's work is language. In response to the declaration of the Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o that writers should write in African languages, Achebe commented, "The British did not push language into my face while I was growing up. So it does not matter what language you write in as long as your writing is good," Achebe states. In fact, Achebe's politics of language recall that of Katib Yassin, the author of Najma. Katib Yassin said that I use French to tell the French that I am not French. So, language for Katib Yassin is a bounty of war, butin de guerre. On the other hand, Ngugi in Kenya was forced to learn English. Colonization enforced or imposed English as the language of education, and as a result, native languages withered away. Therefore, how can the African experience be expressed properly in another language? This was destructive to African literatures. Philip, in the first quotation, said English is not a foreign language, it is a foreign anguish. Ngugi wa Thiong'o argued that by continuing to write in foreign languages, we are perpetuating colonialism. We are continuing the new colonial, slavish, and cringing spirit. In fact, Ngugi's point of view recalls that of Malik Haddad, the Algerian author who refused to write in French after independence. Malik Haddad said about French language that it is the exile of his readers. It is his exile and the exile of his readers. That's why he stopped writing in French, because he did not know Arabic or another native language in Algeria. At this stage, we shall discuss oral traditions and the written word in African literature. So, African literatures are oral par excellence. Like the Arabs, like the American Indians, they don't have written languages. That's why most of their literatures are oral. Even for the Arabs, we know that poetry, even the Quran, was oral at first. So, oral literature, including stories, dramas, riddles, histories, myths, songs, proverbs, and other expressions, is frequently employed to educate and entertain children. Oral histories, myths, and proverbs additionally serve to remind whole communities of their ancestors' heroic deeds, their past, and the precedents for their customs and tradition. We may say that orality or oral traditions in Africa or oral literatures are the record and the register of our culture. We will give at this juncture some examples of oral traditions in Africa. So the griot, which is pronounced in French, is or has a lot of social and cultural roles. He is a performer and interpreter, a praise singer, an oral historian, a storyteller, a singer, dancer, spokesperson, an ambassador, a master of ceremony, a tutor. He can be a genealogist, a musician, a composer, a town crier, an exhorter of troops about to go into the battle. So European language writers like Senghor, Kane, Achebe, and Soyinka are not the only professional authors in Africa. So the region is also dense with griots. In fact, African authors that are mentioned above, they were influenced by griot. They borrowed from the griot. They borrowed stories and folk tales, because the griot is above all a storyteller. Another example is the song of abuse, which is used by powerless individuals, notably women and youth. They made use of the lessons provided by this oral genre to make complaints against powerful figures in the society in an implicit way, not an explicit way, not an overt way. They used symbols, allusions, similes, and analogies rather than direct naming of the target in the real world. Another aspect of orality is the folk tale. We have a picture here of a spider. It is the famous folk tale of Anansi. Anansi, the spider, which is considered as the spirit of wisdom. Anansi is a trickster. He tricked a lot of gods, a lot of people in the stories, in these folk tales. So let us give a definition of the folk tale. It is the most important strand within the prose narrative complex in Africa. It is also the most widely studied. So, however, there are a lot of similarities between the folktale as a genre and other expressive genres such as the myth, the epic, the dilemma tale, legends, and proverbs. So, African novelists like Chinua Achebe often introduced oral stories such as narrative proverbs, song tales, myths, fairy tales, animal fables, anecdotes, and ballads into literature. Throughout Achebe's Things Fall Apart, many lessons are taught and many stories are told. Over the course of the novel, Achebe inserts smaller stories which are the folk tales of the Igbo society. The folk tales connect to their place in the novel and give the reader a sense of what Igbo values are. So we may say that the novel has a didactic value. It teaches us about the Igbo culture. So these stories are powerful, and Achebe uses their power to hook the attention of the reader again and again. Now, after we have finished with the characteristics of African literature, let us discuss some African movements and schools of thought. We intend to highlight the evolution of the African thought that shaped modern African literary production in the modern age. So let us start with Pan-Africanism. It is the idea that peoples of African descent have common interests and should be unified. Historically, Pan-Africanism has often taken the shape of a political or cultural movement. There are many varieties of Pan-Africanism. In fact, in its narrowest political manifestation, Pan-Africanists envision a unified African nation where all people of the African diaspora can live. In more general terms, Pan-Africanism is the sentiment, the feeling, the idea that people of African descent have a great deal in common, a fact that deserves notice and even celebration. The true father of modern Pan-Africanism was the influential thinker Du Bois. His statement that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line was made with Pan-Africanist sentiments in mind. For Du Bois, the problem of the color line was not confined merely to the United States and its Negro problem. Du Bois' famous statement was made with the clear knowledge that many Africans living on the African continent suffered under the European colonial rule. Among the most prominent black intellectuals who advocated Pan-Africanist ideas were Leopold Senghor, the president or the first president of Senegal, and he used to be a poet too, and Aimé Césaire from the Caribbean. They were natives of Senegal and Martinique respectively. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya was also an important figure in Pan-Africanist thought. Senghor and Caesar in particular were greatly influenced by Du Bois and by several Harlem Renaissance writers in the United States, especially Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. The most important figure in this period was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who believed that European colonial rule of Africa could be extinguished if Africans could unite politically and economically. We all know his famous speech of unite or perish. In short, in conclusion, these ideas gave African literature a new soul. All authors attempt to rebuild the African individual, to rebuild the African identity. This African individual who was subjected to centuries of colonialism. So we may say that the era of colonialism was a historical void, a historical limbo. It was empty. There was no culture, no language, no evolution, no development. The second and the last school of thought, which is the Negritude movement. Let us read this quotation by Caliban. Caliban is a slave in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. This quotation will introduce or will synthesize the process of thinking in this movement, the Negritude movement. Caliban talked to his master, saying that you taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. The Red Plague rid you for learning me your language. What does it mean here? So, the Negritude movement uses French language, the language of the colonizer, to criticize the colonizer itself. So, it uses a European language as a weapon to infiltrate the ranks of the enemy and destroys him from the inside. So this literary genre used the opposition between white and black to construct an African personality. They advocated and celebrated blackness. For them, blackness is beautiful. Black is beautiful. It is not ugly anymore. So, we shall give some quotations here to crystallize their line of thinking. So, Lewis and Cousy said that black consciousness really begins with the shock of discovery that one is not only black but is also non-white. So, here we are talking about the opposition between black and white. Leopold Sédar Senghor said that we must in fact create on the soil of Africa a new man and a new humanism. So they want to rebuild African identity, to reconstruct African identity that was lost during colonialism, during this historical void. Aimé Césaire added that it must not be forgotten that the word negritude was at first reposed. The word nègre had been thrown at us as an insult, and we picked it up and turned it into a positive concept. However, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous existentialist philosopher, in his preface to Senghor, spoke of racism in French, racism anti-racist, that there are a lot of anti-white sentiments in their poetry and their writings. They are anti-Western, anti-European language in their speeches, plays, poems, and novels. And well, so blanc or white becomes a negative image in their poetry. The same for Soyinka, the Nobel Prize laureate from Nigeria. He criticized the Negritude movement. He said that a tiger does not have to proclaim his tigritude. You don't have to repeat that you are black again and again and try to convince the other that you are proud of your blackness. So it's too much. As a conclusion, we may say that African literature is about the exploitation of man by man. It's about poverty, illiteracy, the social and political racism that the black suffers from. It's about forced labor, inequalities, oppression and injustice. It is about lies, crimes committed in the names of liberty, in the name of religion, in the name of civilization. So African literature is, well, it is about equality, fraternity. This is the conclusion. This is what is. So we try to give an insight into a colossal topic. African literature is a very huge, colossal topic. So we try to summarize it. Thank you so much.